There is a moment that changes everything. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that anyone photographs or includes in a speech. It arrives quietly, often in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and it feels less like a revelation than a long exhale. I did not realize you had been holding for 40 years. The moment I am describing is this: you stop explaining yourself. Not in anger, not in surrender. You simply set down the weight of needing other people to understand your choices, approve your direction, or agree with your version of events. And you discover, perhaps for the first time since childhood, that life becomes remarkably lighter the instant you do. My dear friends, I did not find this freedom in my 40s. I certainly did not find it in my 50s, though I searched for it in 100 directions. I spent more years than I care to count constructing explanations that nobody had ever asked for, defending decisions that required no defense, and rehearsing justifications in the shower the way other people rehearse song lyrics. I was skilled at it, I must admit. I could explain my choices to my children, my colleagues, my neighbors, and the occasional acquaintance who looked at me sideways at the grocery store. I believed, genuinely and completely, that the right explanation, delivered clearly enough, patiently enough, thoroughly enough, would eventually produce understanding, and understanding, I told myself, would finally produce peace. I was mistaken about almost every part of that. What I did not grasp then, and what I believe most people only discover past the age of 60, if they discover it at all, is that the need to explain yourself is not really about the other person. It never was. It is about a quiet, persistent fear that without their approval, you are somehow incomplete, that without their agreement, your choices are somehow invalid, that without their understanding, your life does not quite add up to something worth having lived. Once I saw it that way, the whole exhausting project of explaining myself looked entirely different. I was not communicating, I was auditioning, and the audience, no matter how long or how skillfully I performed for them, was never going to give me the standing ovation I was really reaching for, because the approval I was seeking could only ever come from one source, and it was not them. It never had been. There is something worth sitting with honestly here. Think about the last time you felt genuinely compelled to explain a decision you made. Perhaps it was something small. Why you chose to retire earlier than your friends expected, why you moved to a smaller town, why you sold the family home that everyone assumed you would keep forever, why you spend your Thursday afternoons the way that you spend them. Now ask yourself what you were actually hoping to receive from that explanation. Were you trying to inform someone who genuinely needed the information? Or were you, underneath the words, waiting for them to tell you that you were right? For most of my life, I was waiting for them to tell me I was right. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates from decades of living inside other people's verdicts. It is not the honest tiredness that follows a day of real work, which fades after a good night of rest and leaves you feeling satisfied with yourself. This kind settles quietly into the chest over years, and by the time you notice its full weight, you have been carrying it so long that it has begun to feel like simply who you are. I have spoken with men and women well into their 70s who describe a heaviness that has followed them their entire adult lives and that they cannot quite name or locate. When they describe it carefully, it is almost always the same thing. They have spent 60-plus years in a courtroom that exists only inside their own minds, continuously building their case for a jury composed entirely of other people's opinions. I know that courtroom well. I spent the better part of 3 decades inside it. What age eventually teaches you, and some people never receive this lesson, no matter how many years they are given, is that the courtroom was always empty. The people you were performing for had already returned to the business of their own lives. They were not deliberating your case. They were not waiting in suspense for your next explanation. They were making dinner, watching something on television, or quietly wondering what their own neighbors and coworkers thought of them. The verdict you spent so much energy bracing for was never coming. because most people are far too consumed by their own need for approval to spend very much time at all judging yours. That realization, when it finally arrived for me, did not feel triumphant. It felt oddly quiet, like discovering that a door you had been banging against for years was never actually locked to begin with. There was a Sunday afternoon I remember clearly. It was raining. I had made a pot of coffee that had gone completely cold before I touched it. When my daughter called to ask why I had chosen to spend the upcoming holiday with an old friend, rather than flying out to see her family, she was not angry. She was simply curious, in the way that people who love you are sometimes curious about the choices you make. And I noticed, the moment she finished asking, that old familiar movement beginning somewhere in my chest, the first words of a long explanation assembling themselves. The history, the context, the reasons stacked carefully on top of each other like a legal brief I had not been asked to prepare. And then, for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I stopped. I said simply that it felt like the right thing for me this year, and that I loved her, and that we would talk again, soon. She said quietly that she understood, and that she just wondered. That was all. The conversation I had been quietly rehearsing for weeks lasted perhaps 40 seconds. I sat there with my cold coffee in the rain against the window and felt something shift somewhere, deep inside me. Not because I had been dismissive or unkind, because I had not been either of those things, but because I had, for what felt like the first time in my adult life, made a decision and simply allowed it to stand on its own. I had not built a case. I had not offered evidence. I had not apologized in that sideways, softening manner that so many of us use when we suspect we owe an explanation but cannot quite admit to ourselves that we do. I had simply lived my life out loud, without a footnote. The freedom that lived inside that 40-second conversation was larger than I can easily put into words even now. Here is something I have spent considerable time thinking about since that afternoon. There is a meaningful difference between explaining yourself and communicating. Real communication is generous. It is offered to help another person understand something that genuinely serves the relationship, and it builds connection rather than consuming it. Explaining yourself, in the sense I am describing, is a different transaction entirely. It is an attempt to purchase acceptance with the currency of justification, and the price of that transaction has a way of rising steadily over time, because there is never quite enough explanation to feel entirely secure. There is always another question waiting, another sideways glance that sends you back to your reasoning with your evidence and your carefully assembled context. At some point, the cost of that transaction becomes more than a thoughtful person should be willing to pay. The people I have admired most during the second half of my life share a quality that I misread badly when I was younger. They make decisions quietly. They explain themselves rarely. They do not follow every choice with a clarifying sentence or an apologetic coda. When someone questions them, they respond without defensiveness and without performance. They are not cold. They are not withholding. They simply have a settled relationship with their own judgment that does not require external confirmation to remain standing. When I was younger, I took this for arrogance or indifference. I understand now that it is neither. It is the particular confidence that comes from having finally, after long years, made peace with the fact that not everyone is going to understand your choices, and having decided that this is not a problem that requires your constant attention to solve. That decision is available to every one of us sitting here. And it costs nothing, except the habit of seeking permission you were never truly owed. I want to be careful not to be misunderstood on one important point. Releasing the need to explain yourself is not the same as becoming indifferent to the people you love. Those are two entirely different things, and I would not want to blur them. The people who genuinely matter to you, the relationships that carry real weight across the years, have never actually required constant justification from you. They want to know that you are well. They want to know you are living with honesty. Real closeness between people does not depend on agreement. It depends on presence, on consistency, on the kind of steady care that does not vanish when opinions diverge. The people who require you to justify your choices before they will offer you warmth are not. If you examine the situation with clear eyes, offering warmth at all, they are offering conditional acceptance, and those two things are not the same. After 65, you have accumulated enough experience to know the difference between the two. You have earned the right to act on that knowledge. Here is the single most useful question I have come across in the past decade of my life, and I offer it to you because it has saved me more unnecessary conversations than I care to calculate. Before you begin any explanation you feel compelled to give, ask yourself this one thing: is this for them or is this for me? If the honest answer is for them, if the explanation will genuinely help them, clarify something important, or strengthen something real between you, then speak. Speak generously and without hesitation. But if the honest answer is for you, if you are hoping to soothe your own discomfort, purchase their approval, or prove a point that your own conscience has already settled, put it down. Let the explanation go. Walk away from the justification and walk toward whatever the afternoon actually has to offer you. That single question has returned to me more hours than I probably deserved to have back at this point in my life. I think of a woman I knew for many years. She had been a school teacher for most of her working life. A quiet and deeply principled person who spent the last years of her life in a manner that genuinely puzzled many of the dumb people around her. She continued driving an old car she was fond of, long after others her age had moved on to newer ones. She spent whole weekends volunteering at a community food pantry while friends encouraged her to travel. She gave away more than most people knew and said almost nothing about any of it. She never explained herself. When someone asked about her choices, she would offer a small, unhurried smile and say something like, "It suits me quite well," and then return to whatever she had been doing before the question arrived. She seemed, to everyone who spent any time with her, genuinely at peace, not performing peace for an audience, actually residing there in the quiet middle of it. I did not understand when I was younger how a person arrived at that place. I believe now that I do. She had simply stopped submitting her life for review. She had reached some interior agreement with herself that her choices, made honestly and without harm to others, were complete the moment she made them. They did not need to be ratified. They did not require an audience or a response. They were simply her life, lived in accordance with what she valued most, and she trusted that internal compass more than she trusted the approval of any room she happened to walk into. That, I have come to believe, is what truly becomes possible after 65 in a way that rarely is before. You finally have enough evidence from your own history to trust your own judgment. You have made enough decisions, lived through enough of their consequences, learned enough from the choices that did not work, and watched enough of the world pass by to understand that your instincts, while imperfect, are honest. They are yours, and they are enough. You no longer need a panel of outside opinion to confirm that. There are things I would tell my younger self if such a conversation were possible. Not about money, not about career, not about the practical construction of a life. About this. About the years spent running explanations through my mind late at night, like a machine that could not be switched off, searching for the exact arrangement of words that would make someone finally understand me. About the dinners I attended in body while some corner of my mind remained stuck in a conversation that had ended 3 days earlier. About the small adjustments I made to my choices over years, softening them slightly, bending them slightly, shaping them just enough to fit what I imagined someone else expected, and the slow, quiet cost of all those tiny compromises accumulating over time. None of it announced itself. That is the difficulty of living for other people's understanding. It does not arrive as a crisis. It settles in gradually at the beginning of adulthood and makes itself so comfortable that you eventually mistake its weight for simply the natural feeling of being a responsible grown person. It is not that, and you are allowed to set it down. The mornings I am working toward, the ones I hope you find, and find soon, are the mornings where the first thought in your mind is not what someone thought of something you said last week, or how you might better explain a choice you made last month, or whether the people around you have endorsed the version of your life you are currently living. The mornings where the first thought is simply, here is today, and it belongs to me, and I am going to spend it in accordance with what I actually value. Those mornings exist. I have lived them, and they feel, in the most unremarkable and ordinary way imaginable, like exactly enough. If I could offer you one gift, my dear friends, it would not be certainty. It would not be a longer road or a smoother one. It would simply be permission. Permission to let your choices stand without a filing of supporting documents. Permission to love the people around you without requiring them to agree with every direction you take. Permission to be misunderstood by some, perhaps even by people who matter to you, and to remain steady inside that misunderstanding, without crumbling. Permission to say, when someone asks for an explanation, you do not feel you owe something as plain and as complete as, "It felt right to me." That sentence, spoken without apology, is the first sentence of a life that belongs entirely to you. After 65, you have carried enough. You have explained enough. You have justified and defended and clarified and qualified enough for several lifetimes. What waits on the other side of all that effort is not isolation. It is not coldness. It is not the bitter silence of someone who has stopped caring about the world. It is, if you allow yourself to reach for it, a kind of peace so simple and so solid that you will wonder, briefly, why you waited this long to claim what was always yours. And then you will stop wondering, because you will have something far better to occupy your attention. You will have the rest of your life finally lived entirely on your own terms. Take good care of yourselves. Be generous with what you still have to give, and be equally careful about what you no longer owe. And the next time you feel that familiar pull, the old need to explain, to justify, to make yourself understood to someone who may not be listening as carefully as you hope, pause for just a moment. Ask yourself honestly whether you need to. And if the true answer is no, simply let it go, and turn toward the afternoon you actually have in front of you, until we meet again.